My name is Harper Grace Johnson. I'm 29 years old, and I want you to really sit with me for the next few minutes, because what I'm about to tell you, it's not just my story. It's the kind of story that lives in the walls of so many families. The kind nobody talks about at Thanksgiving. The kind that gets buried under "we love each other." And that's just how they are. And let it go, Harper, it was a long time ago. But here's the thing about things that were a long time ago. They don't just disappear. They sit inside you. They shape the decisions you make, the people you trust, the way you show up for yourself when nobody else does. And eventually, the truth has a way of surfacing. No matter how deep you bury it, no matter how many years of silence stack up on top of it, it surfaces. Every time. So, yeah, I'm 29. And 7 years ago, on the single most important day of my academic life, the day I walked across a stage and accepted a degree I had bled, cried, and sacrificed 4 years of my life for, my parents weren't there. Not because of an emergency, not because of a flight delay or a medical issue or some catastrophic thing that left them genuinely no choice. They weren't there because my sister, Brianna, had planned a birthday party for herself on the same day. And my parents chose the party. They chose her over me, without hesitation, without apology. And for a very, very long time, I told myself that was okay. I told myself I was fine. I told myself it didn't matter. Spoiler alert, it mattered. It mattered so much that 7 years later, it was still the first thing that came to mind every single time I heard the word graduation. It mattered in the way that only the things we pretend don't matter actually do. Let me back up, because I want you to understand the full picture. I grew up in a suburb outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. The kind of neighborhood where the lawns were always perfectly edged, and the neighbors waved at you from their driveways, and everything looked just right on the outside. We were the Johnson family. My dad, Richard Johnson, was a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company. He wore button-down shirts even on weekends, drove a clean gray sedan, and believed very deeply in appearances. What the neighbors thought mattered to him, what the people at church thought mattered to him. The image of the family, the Johnson family with our matching Christmas card photos and our well-maintained front porch and our polite hellos at school events, mattered to him more than almost anything else. He was not a bad man. I want to say that clearly because this story gets complicated, and I don't want you to walk away thinking he was some kind of villain. He was a flawed man, a man shaped by his own upbringing, his own blind spots, his own very human failures. But he was not bad. He just was not, for a very long time, paying attention to the right things. My mom, Linda Johnson, was a dental hygienist part-time and a full-time people pleaser. She was warm in the way that women who've spent their whole lives shrinking themselves can be warm, accommodating, soft-spoken, always smoothing things over, always making sure nobody was uncomfortable. She had this ability to walk into a tense room and de-escalate everything before the tension even had a chance to breathe. She was good at keeping the peace. What she was not good at, what she had never learned to do, was acknowledge that keeping the peace sometimes came at a cost. That the cost was usually paid by me. That I was the one who got smoothed over, gotten past, made to understand, expected to absorb and not react. My mom didn't do this maliciously. She did it because it was the only way she knew how to function. But good intentions do not cancel out real harm. That took me a long time and a very good therapist to fully understand. But before Brianna, before I get to the part of the story you're probably here for, I want to paint the fuller picture of what growing up in the Johnson house actually looked like because I think it matters. I think it explains a lot of things that might otherwise seem confusing. Like why I didn't push back harder. Like why I rationalized for so long. Like why it took a college graduation of all things of all moments to make the pattern undeniable. My parents were not cruel people. I want to be clear about that. There was love in our house. Real love, hugs and family dinners, and my dad teaching me to ride a bike in the driveway, and my mom staying up late to help me with a history project even when she was tired. There was warmth. The love was real. The problem was never the absence of love. The problem was the distribution of it, the way it pulled more heavily in one direction, The way one of us always seemed to need just a little more of everything, more patience, more flexibility, more of the benefit of the doubt. And the way my parents always had just a little more to give in that direction. Not because they made a conscious decision to favor one child over the other. I don't believe that. But intention does not determine impact. You can love imperfectly without meaning to and still cause damage that is real and lasting, and that takes years to fully understand. And then there was Brianna Marie Johnson, 2 years younger than me, which made her 20 when I graduated. Brianna was, okay, how do I describe Brianna without sounding bitter? Because I've done a lot of work on myself, and I genuinely don't want this to be a hate story. It's not a hate story, but Brianna was the golden child. Full stop. She was the one who got the extra slice of cake, the later curfew, the benefit of the doubt in every single argument, the louder applause at every single achievement. She was bubbly and charming, and she knew exactly how to work a room, especially a room that contained our parents. She could turn on the tears like a faucet. She could make herself look like the victim of any situation within about 45 seconds flat. And my parents fell for it every single time. Not because they were stupid. They weren't. But because Brianna needed them in a way I had stopped allowing myself to need them. And some parents, some people respond to need more than they respond to strength. I was strong, so I got less. I want to be clear. I love my sister, or I love the idea of the sister she could have been, the sister I always hoped she might become. Because the Brianna I grew up with was not easy to love. Not because she was evil, but because she was enabled. There's a critical difference between those two things. When you spend your entire childhood being told that you are the priority, that your feelings matter most, that the world will rearrange itself for you, you don't develop the tools to function when it doesn't. Nobody taught Brianna that other people's feelings were real and equal. Nobody taught her that her choices had consequences that landed on people who weren't her. And my parents built that in her, brick by brick, year by year, with every time they chose her side without asking questions, and every time they expected me to understand, and every time they called their favoritism by gentler names like she's more sensitive, or she just needs more support. She needed more support because they never required anything of her. But nobody was saying that part out loud. Growing up, the imbalance was always there, but I had gotten good at rationalizing it. Brianna was younger. She needed more attention. Brianna was more sensitive. She needed more protection. Brianna was still figuring things out. She needed more patience. There was always a reason, always an excuse dressed up neatly as an explanation. And I was the older one, so I was expected to understand, to be mature, to not make it a thing. I became very, very good at not making things a thing. I became so good at swallowing my own feelings that I genuinely didn't notice how much I was carrying until years later, when a therapist in Chicago asked me to describe my childhood in 3 words, and without thinking I said quiet, capable, invisible. She wrote all 3 of them down and looked at me and said, "Tell me about invisible." And that was the beginning of a very long and necessary conversation. Let me tell you about the years leading up to graduation, because context matters here. I got into the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill on a partial academic scholarship. I was the first person in my immediate family to get into a school of that caliber. And I remember coming home with the acceptance letter shaking in my hands, and my dad looking at it and nodding and saying, "Good job," and going back to watching the game on television. Not bad, not dismissive exactly, just not what I had imagined. I had imagined something bigger, some moment of genuine recognition. Instead, it was "good job" and the click of the remote. Meanwhile, when Brianna got accepted to the local community college 2 years later, my mom cried actual happy tears, and my dad took the whole family out to dinner at the nicest restaurant in town. I remember sitting at that table, eating my pasta, telling myself it was fine, that people expressed pride differently, that it didn't mean anything. I was very talented at that. Telling myself things didn't mean anything when they clearly, obviously did. College was hard in all the ways that matter. I'm not going to sugarcoat it or make it a montage. I was on a partial scholarship, which meant I was working part-time at the campus library 20 hours a week to cover what the scholarship didn't. I was taking a full course load. I was studying business administration with a concentration in finance, not the most glamorous sounding major, but one I had chosen with intention because I wanted stability, I wanted skills that translated to real earning power, I wanted a path I had built myself that nobody could take away. I was far enough from home that going back on weekends wasn't practical. I had a small, clean dorm room and later a small, clean apartment with a roommate named Destiny who became, over 4 years, genuinely one of the most important people in my life. Destiny was from Savannah, Georgia, pre-med, brilliant and loud in the best way, the kind of person who made every room feel more alive just by walking into it. She was the first person who really saw me, not the capable, composed version of me I showed everyone, but the version underneath that was tired and homesick and carrying more than she let on. Destiny had a way of asking, "How are you actually doing?" that made it impossible to give a surface answer. She dragged the real things out of me over late-night study sessions and bad dining hall coffee. She was my first experience of being truly known by another person, and it showed me that I was, in fact, knowable. That the version of me I had been hiding wasn't some terrible secret. It was just someone who needed a safe place to exist. Destiny was that place. I am grateful for her in ways I still don't have complete words for. Those 4 years changed me fundamentally. College does that. You get dropped into a world where nobody knows your family name, nobody knows your history, nobody has a preconceived idea of who you are or what role you're supposed to play. You get to just be yourself, whatever that turns out to be. And I found out that who I was, stripped of all the family dynamics and the older sister obligations and the constant unspoken comparison to Brianna, I was actually pretty great. I was sharp and driven and funny when I wasn't exhausted, and I had good instincts about people, and I worked hard not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I genuinely loved the work. I found a version of myself that I liked, a version I respected, and that version of me showed up every single day for 4 years and graduated with honors. There were nights, more than I can count, when I sat in the campus library at 2 in the morning with a finance textbook open in front of me and a cold cup of coffee at my elbow, and I thought about quitting. Not seriously, not in a way where you actually act on it, but in the way where the weight compresses into a single moment, and you just need to acknowledge that it is heavy. I thought about Brianna back home, presumably asleep in her comfortable room, and I felt something that was not quite jealousy but was adjacent to it. A tired ache at the unfairness of the different roads we were on and how little anyone seemed to notice the difference. But then I would close that feeling away the way I had always learned to close things and go back to the textbook. Because what was the alternative? Going home was not the alternative. Giving up was not the alternative. The only thing I knew how to do with a hard road was keep walking it. Sophomore year was the hardest. My scholarship had a GPA requirement, which meant every grade mattered financially, practically, concretely. I was taking 18 credits while working at the library and tutoring 2 students in intro-level finance on the side. I lost 10 pounds that year that I could not afford to lose. I had a stretch in March where I was sick for 3 weeks straight and went to every single class anyway, tissues in my pocket, voice half gone, because missing class meant falling behind, and falling behind was a luxury I did not have. I did not tell my parents any of this. Not because I could not have, but because I knew with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent her whole life reading the room that telling them would not produce the support I needed. It would produce concern that would quickly become about managing their feelings about my difficulties rather than actually helping me. So I did not tell them. I figured it out. I always figured it out. I kept my GPA above a 3.7 the entire 4 years. I finished my senior thesis 3 weeks early. My finance professor, Dr. Elaine Carter, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had spent 20 years in investment banking before returning to teach, and who did not give compliments as a matter of principle, told me at the end of my senior year that I was one of the strongest students she had taught in a decade, and that I should go somewhere that deserved my talent. She wrote me a recommendation letter for my first job that I have printed out and kept in a folder to this day. Because sometimes the recognition that matters most comes from the people who don't owe it to you. Sometimes the people who are supposed to see you don't, and the ones who don't have to are the ones who do. I learned that early. I have never forgotten it. Okay, so graduation. May. I was 22 years old. The ceremony was on a Saturday morning at 10 a.m. on the main quad. It was a big deal. Chapel Hill graduations always are. There's something about that campus, the old brick buildings and the white columns, and the way the May light falls across everything with this kind of golden, historic weight. That makes the whole day feel like it actually means something. Like you're part of something that has meant something for a very long time. My whole friend group was there. Destiny's entire family had driven 4 hours from Savannah. My friend Marcus had his grandparents there from Philadelphia. My friend Jess had her mom and 2 aunts from Charlotte, and they had made a whole celebratory weekend of it. People came from everywhere. Families were everywhere. It was one of those days saturated with love and pride, and the particular joy of watching someone you care about finish something hard. The week before graduation, the energy on campus shifted in that particular way it does in the final stretch, something lighter and heavier at the same time. People were taking last walks around the quad, photographing favorite spots, making promises to stay in touch that some would keep and some would not. Destiny and I went to our favorite coffee shop near Franklin Street 2 days before the ceremony and sat there for 3 hours, not talking about anything particularly important. She told me she was proud of me, not of my grades or my job offer or my honors standing, just of me. She said she had watched me work harder than anyone she had ever known and carry more than anyone she knew without visibly breaking, and she wanted me to hear it said out loud. I cried a little right there in that coffee shop, which Destiny immediately teased me about, and the teasing made the crying feel okay rather than embarrassing. That is what the right people do. They make the real things feel safe. I had sent my parents the date in January. I sent it in a text, in an email, and I circled it on a physical calendar I mailed home with a note that said, "Please hold this date." In February, when the university sent out the formal graduation invitations, I addressed and stamped my parents and mailed it immediately. In March, I called my mom with the logistics. Where to park, what time the doors opened, which entrance to use, where to meet me on the east side of the quad after the ceremony. She said they'd be there. She sounded happy about it. My dad got on the phone briefly and said, "Wouldn't miss it, sweetheart." I booked them a hotel 3 blocks from campus. I made a dinner reservation for 5 people, me, my parents, Destiny, and Aunt Patricia, at a restaurant near Franklin Street that had been on my list for 2 years. I had the whole day planned out because that was how I operated. I planned. I prepared. I covered every angle. Because I had learned from experience that if I didn't handle things, things didn't get handled. 2 weeks before graduation, Brianna announced that she wanted to throw herself a birthday party. Her birthday was May 14th, the exact same weekend as my graduation. Now, Brianna's birthday had always been in May. Mine had always been in September. My graduation date had been set and communicated since the previous November. There was no confusion about the overlap. There was no innocent scheduling mistake. Brianna knew when my graduation was. She had known for months, and she chose that weekend anyway. And she did not choose a small dinner or a backyard cookout. She rented a banquet room at a hotel on the other side of Charlotte, sent invitations to 60-something people, arranged catering, hired a photographer, and planned an event that was by design impossible to walk away from once it was in motion. When I called my mom to finalize the graduation details, I could tell from the first second of the call that something was off. There was a hesitation in her voice, that particular quality she had when she was about to say something she knew was wrong, but had already decided to say anyway. I felt it before I even finished my sentence. I said, "Mom, we're still on for graduation day, right? Hotel's all set." And there was this pause, this awful, stomach-dropping, telling pause that lasted maybe 3 seconds, but felt like a minute. And then she said, "Harper, honey, Brianna already sent out the invitations. People are coming from out of state. We can't just cancel on everyone." I remember standing in my apartment, phone against my ear, looking at the wall. I remember the specific quality of the silence in the room. I said slowly and clearly, "Mom, my graduation is the same day." And she said, "And I need you to really hear this because I want you to understand what was said to me." She said, "I know, sweetheart, but you understand, right? You're so mature, and you'll have so many more things to celebrate. Brianna needs this. You'll have so many more things to celebrate." I was graduating from college with honors after 4 years of working 2 jobs and maintaining a 3.7 GPA, and my mother was telling me this wasn't the important one, because Brianna needed a birthday party, because Brianna always needed something, and whatever Brianna needed, the rest of us reorganized around. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I said okay. I hung up. I called my dad immediately, hoping, I don't even know what I was hoping for. Some version of a father who would say, "Linda, what on earth are we talking about? Of course we are going to our daughter's college graduation." Instead, my dad told me the situation was complicated, and that Brianna had worked really hard on the event, and that I should try to see it from her perspective. From her perspective, I had spent 4 years grinding through a degree program while working part-time and maintaining honors-level academics, and my father was asking me to see the situation from the perspective of my 20-year-old sister, who had booked a venue over my graduation because she wanted a party. I thanked my father for his time. I actually said those words in that order with exactly that tone. "Thanks for your time, Dad." And I hung up. Then I sat down on the floor of my apartment and stared at the wall for a very long time. I want to tell you something about that moment on the floor. I did not cry. Not right then. What I felt was too large and too specific to come out as tears. It was more like a complete rearrangement of my internal landscape. Like a map I had been using my whole life had just revealed itself to be drawn wrong. Every story I had told myself about my family. Every time I had said they loved me, even if they showed it imperfectly, even if the showing was uneven, even if I had to be more understanding than was fair, all of it was being quietly revised in real time. By a phone call, by a birthday party, by my mother asking me to see it from Brianna's perspective. I thought about the Christmas when I was 16 and placed 3rd in the state academic competition, and came home to find my parents had thrown a dinner party for Brianna's volleyball team that same night. Dinner was done. I was offered leftovers, and a quick, "We heard you did great, honey." I thought about the summer internship I got at a financial firm, the first student from my high school to land one, and how my mom spent the entire dinner conversation that evening asking Brianna about her new part-time job at the boutique. I thought about every achievement, every moment I had needed to be seen, and the response that was always just enough to technically count, but never quite enough to actually fill the space. And then I thought about Brianna's community college acceptance dinner, the restaurant, the tears, the applause. And I understood, in a way deeper than words, that the birthday party was not an exception. It was the pattern made, finally, undeniably visible. Destiny found me like that. When she got home from the library, she dropped her bag in the doorway and sat down on the floor right next to me without saying a word, which is one of the things I have always loved most about her. She knows when to wait. After a minute, I told her what had happened, all of it, and the look on her face, that specific look that is not pity but is something adjacent to pity, something that says, "I cannot believe this is the reality you are living in, and I am so sorry." That look told me everything I needed to know about whether I was overreacting. I was not overreacting. This was real. This was wrong. I was allowed to feel exactly as devastated as I felt. Destiny offered to drive to Charlotte and collect my parents herself. I said no. She offered to let me skip graduation entirely and just go somewhere we actually wanted to be. I said no to that too, because the one thing I had decided, sitting there on that floor, was that I was not going to let this take graduation away from me. That day belonged to me. I had earned it, and I was going to walk across that stage and receive my degree and feel every bit of the pride I deserved to feel, and I was going to do it regardless of whether the people who should have been there were there. I was going to do it for myself. Maybe especially for myself. My Aunt Patricia, my dad's older sister, a woman who had always been quietly, consistently in my corner, found out what was happening through a phone call with my mom and immediately called me. She was furious in a very measured, very controlled way that was somehow more powerful than yelling. She said she would be there. She said she would drive 4 hours from Raleigh, and she would be in the front row, and I was not going to walk across that stage alone. And she was there. She showed up in a bright purple dress with a bouquet of white tulips and a wide, fierce smile, and she stood at the edge of the quad and screamed my name when they called it, and I could hear her above everyone else. My Aunt Patricia in her purple dress. I will never, as long as I live, forget that image. After the ceremony, she took me and Destiny to the restaurant I had reserved, and we sat there for 3 hours and ate good food and drank good wine and talked about real things. Aunt Patricia told me that she loved me. She said that what my parents had done was wrong, not complicated, not nuanced, not the result of difficult circumstances, just wrong, and that I deserved to hear that said plainly. She told me I was exceptional and that the people who couldn't see that were working with a limitation that had nothing to do with me. She talked to me like I was a full person, like my feelings were real and my hurt was valid, and my worth was not contingent on whether my parents showed up to confirm it. I was 22 years old, and it was the most honest conversation I had ever had with a member of my family. And I cried in the middle of it, just briefly, the kind of cry that releases something rather than just expressing it. Graduation itself was, look, it was beautiful. When they called my name, and I walked across that stage, something happened in my chest that I had no word for. Pride, yes. Relief, definitely. But something else underneath all of that, something harder to name. A reckoning, maybe a moment of looking at yourself and understanding what you are actually made of. I had done this without a safety net, without consistent support, without the easy confidence of someone who always knew people were in their corner. I had done this by myself, for myself, and that was worth something. That was worth a great deal. I shook the dean's hand. I held my diploma up. My friends cheered like I was the last person standing, and maybe, in some ways, I didn't speak to my parents for 3 weeks after graduation. They called a few times, and I let it go to voicemail. My mom left a message saying that Brianna's party had gone beautifully, and that she wished I could have been there. I listened to that voicemail twice, standing in my kitchen, just to make sure I was hearing it correctly. She wished I could have been there. At my sister's birthday party, on the day of my own graduation, the graduation they had chosen not to attend. I put the phone down on the counter, and I went for a very long walk, and by the time I got back, I had made a decision. I was going to stop expecting things from people who had clearly shown me their limitations. I was going to stop banking on a closeness that was, at best, a surface performance. Not out of anger, out of self-preservation, out of respect for myself. When I finally took their calls, there was no apology. There was a version of, we're sorry you feel hurt, which anyone who has been on the receiving end of that construction knows is not an apology. It is a way of acknowledging your pain while simultaneously declining any responsibility for having caused it. My dad said something about how family sticks together, and I said I completely agreed and let the irony drift between us without comment. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was genuinely addressed. They moved forward as they always moved forward, and I was expected to do the same. So I did. On the outside, I graduated in May, moved back to Charlotte temporarily, and by August, I had started a junior analyst position at a mid-size financial consulting firm. I threw myself into the work the way I always threw myself into things, completely, precisely, with a focus that other people sometimes mistook for intensity. I was intense. I had always been intense. It was what happened when you were the kind of person who learned early that the only reliable variable in your life was yourself. A year after graduation, I started therapy. Dr. Nadia Williams, a black woman in her 40s with an office full of natural light and a green velvet couch and a very calm, very direct way of getting to the center of things without making you feel like you're being excavated. I told her everything, graduation, my parents, Brianna, the years of rationalization and swallowing and performing okayness I didn't feel. She didn't tell me what to feel or give me a roadmap. She asked questions. She asked me why I kept showing up for people who had repeatedly shown me I was not their first priority. She asked me what I was afraid would happen if I stopped absorbing things for other people. She asked me, and this one hit differently than the rest, she asked me what I thought I deserved. I didn't have a good answer. I didn't have any answer. She said, let's work on that. We worked on it for 2 years, and what we built was something I had never had before, a clear, unshakable sense of my own value that did not need external confirmation to remain intact. I also started setting quiet limits with my family. Not dramatic ones, not ultimatums or confrontations. Internal ones. The kind you set when you finally stop trying to draw water from a well that has run dry. I stopped calling every week. I stopped attending every family event and went only to the ones I genuinely chose. I stopped expecting my parents to ask about my life with actual curiosity, and so I stopped being hurt when they did not. What I found in lowering my expectations to something honest was that the relationship became less painful. Not better yet, not repaired, just less painful, which was at that point progress, which was actually enough. My professional life moved fast. By 23, I was good enough at my job that people were noticing. By 24, I had a promotion, a team of my own, and an offer from a firm in Chicago that made the decision to leave Charlotte feel less like a gamble and more like an inevitability. I loved Charlotte. I had found real community there, a group of women through a running club who became genuinely important to me, Tanya and Simone, and Kelsey, women who showed up and checked in and knew the real version of me, not just the professional one. Leaving them was hard. It was one of the genuinely hard things I have done in my life. But Chicago was calling with a clarity I recognized, the same clarity I had felt when I chose Chapel Hill, when I chose finance, when I chose to sit on that apartment floor after graduation and decide not to let anything take that day from me. Chicago remade me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The city itself did something. The sheer scale of it, the anonymity, the way you could walk down Michigan Avenue at 7 in the morning and be completely invisible and completely present at the same time. I rented a 1-bedroom in Lincoln Park with high ceilings and a window in the kitchen that overlooked a tree-lined street, and I decorated it slowly and carefully the way you do when you finally have a space that is entirely your own. I bought art I actually liked. I cooked real meals on Sunday evenings. I found a therapist, Dr. Okafor, who wore bow ties and had an enormous bookshelf and a quiet patience that was exactly what I needed. I kept working on myself. I did not stop working on myself. That was the commitment I had made, and I kept it. I dated in Chicago. There was a graphic designer named Josh who was creative and interesting, but ultimately more invested in being mysterious than in being known. There was Marcus Reeves, a structural engineer I met through a mutual friend at a gallery opening in Wicker Park, who was steady and thoughtful and funny in the dry, understated way I find completely irresistible. Marcus and I dated for 2 years. We broke up not because anything was wrong between us, but because he wanted to go back to Detroit eventually, and I was building something in Chicago I was not willing to uproot. It was the sad kind of ending that is clean, real grief over a real loss without villains or betrayal. I still think of him warmly. What that relationship gave me, beyond the relationship itself, was proof that I was capable of being loved well, that I could receive care without deflecting it, that I could be fully known by someone and still be chosen. That was new territory. It mattered enormously. Year 25, I turned 25 surrounded by new friends in my own apartment. And I remember looking around that room, people I had known less than a year who had said yes, who had shown up, who were genuinely glad to be there celebrating me, and feeling something I had been chasing without knowing I was chasing it. Chosen. Not because I was the capable one or the strong one or the one who could be counted on, but just because I was me and they liked me and wanted to be in the same room as me. That feeling landed somewhere deep and stayed there. My relationship with my parents during those years was maintenance level. Holiday calls, birthday calls, occasional visits to Charlotte that were cordial and surface and never touched the real thing. The graduation was never mentioned. I had stopped expecting it to be. I had moved it to a different folder in my mind, not forgotten, never forgotten, but categorized. This is what happened. This is what they chose. This is what I know about who they are. File closed. I was not cold with them. I was just Honest. Honest in the private, interior way that nobody else can see, the way where you love someone and know your love has appropriate limits, and those limits are not a failure, they are a fact. I want to pause here because I think this part of the story, the quiet middle years, the years of building without anyone watching, is the part that gets skipped in stories like this one. Everyone wants the dramatic moments, the confrontations, the phone calls where someone finally says the true thing. Those moments matter, but so does the long, unglamorous, completely private work of becoming someone you can trust. So does the year you figure out how to hold a boundary without anyone applauding you for it. So does the Sunday morning you wake up in your own apartment, in a city you chose, in a life you built yourself, and realize with quiet certainty that you are not waiting for anyone's permission anymore. Those quiet moments are the actual story. The dramatic ones are just the proof of it. I kept a journal during those years. Nothing disciplined, just a notebook I wrote in when I needed to work something out that I could not yet speak. I read some of those entries recently, and what struck me was how consistently I was working on myself. Page after page of honest questions. Things I was trying to understand about myself, about my family, about what I wanted, and what I was willing to accept. I was not waiting for my family to change before I started healing. I was not holding my own growth hostage to their acknowledgement. I was just doing the work because it was the only thing that made sense. Because the only life fully within my control was mine. And I had decided a long time ago on a floor in Chapel Hill that I was going to make it count. I turned 28 the summer of Brianna's wedding. I was a bridesmaid. I had said yes because she was my sister, and I meant it when I said I wanted good things for her life. The wedding was beautiful. Brianna was radiant in a way I had never seen her, glowing with a happiness that seemed genuinely earned rather than performed. Her husband Derek cried when she walked down the aisle, and I, standing up there in my dusty rose dress, felt something unexpected move through me. Not jealousy, not resentment, just tenderness. The kind you feel when you see someone being loved well. I danced at the reception and gave a toast that made people laugh and cry in equal measure and meant every word of it. 4 months after the wedding, my dad had a stroke. It happened on a Tuesday morning in November. He was in a meeting at work and he collapsed. His assistant called 911 and he was in the ER within 20 minutes. They stabilized him quickly. But the stroke had done real damage. The left side of his body was affected, and his speech was significantly impaired. The doctors were honest about recovery. Long, uncertain, requiring intensive and sustained rehabilitation. Nothing about it was simple. My mom called me from the hospital, barely coherent through the crying. I booked a flight for the next morning without hesitation. Whatever history sat between me and my parents, whatever unresolved things lived in the space of our relationship, none of that mattered when my father was in a hospital bed and my mother was falling apart. You show up. That's the decision. I had made that decision about who I wanted to be a long time ago, and I held to it. What I walked into when I arrived was a family in total crisis, and not just medically. My mom was emotionally collapsed, functional on the surface, completely overwhelmed underneath. Brianna was paralyzed by panic, the way she had always been paralyzed by things that required her to function outside of her comfort zone. Derek was doing his best, but he was managing Brianna rather than managing anything logistical. Nobody had asked the doctors the right questions. Nobody had a clear picture of what the next steps were. Nobody had called the insurance company or researched rehabilitation facilities or set up a system for information sharing. The hospital room had the chaotic, helpless energy of people waiting for someone else to take control. So I took control. Not because I wanted to be in charge. I was exhausted from the flight and scared in a way I hadn't let myself fully feel yet. But because I could see what needed to be done, and I had the ability to do it, and standing there watching my family spin out was worse than stepping in. I sat down with the neurologist for 40 minutes and took 6 pages of notes. I asked about the extent of the damage, the imaging results, the best case and worst case rehabilitation scenarios, the timeline, the options. I called the insurance company from the hospital parking lot. 45 minutes on hold, another 30 untangling the coverage details, and came back inside with a clear picture of what was covered and what wasn't. I researched every rehabilitation facility within 30 miles, read reviews, called 2 of them, and had a recommendation ready by the end of the first day. I built a shared document with the medical information, the insurance details, the contact numbers, the questions we still needed to ask. I set it up so my mom could access it on her phone. On the second day, I stepped outside the hospital for 10 minutes because I needed air. I had been running on 4 hours of sleep and continuous crisis management, and I needed 60 seconds of not being in charge of anything. I stood in the parking lot in the cold November air, and I let myself feel scared. Really scared. In the private, honest way, I had always kept my fear. My dad was 62 and he had had a stroke, and the man I had watched move through the world with quiet, methodical certainty was lying in a hospital bed, not certain of anything. And whatever complicated things existed between us, I loved him. I had always loved him. Love and hurt had coexisted in me for as long as I could remember. And there in that parking lot, they coexisted again. Fear for him, love for him, the old ache of things we had never said and might never get to say. I gave myself those 60 seconds. All of it. Then I went back inside. My mom kept saying, I don't know what to do, and I kept telling her, one step at a time, exactly what we were doing. I didn't fall apart in front of anyone. I was scared, genuinely scared, but I put it somewhere I could access it later, and I functioned. That was what I had always done. That was, for better or worse, what I was built for. Brianna came to me on the second day and said, Harper, I don't understand how you're doing this. How are you this calm? And I looked at her, really looked at her, this younger sister of mine who had spent our whole lives being the one who needed things. And I said quietly, without any accusation in it, because someone has to be. She was quiet for a moment, and then she nodded, and something in her face shifted, some small rearrangement that I filed away but didn't press on. There would be time for that later. There is always time for those conversations later, if you are both still alive and willing. I stayed in Charlotte for 2 weeks. I coordinated my dad's transfer to the best rehabilitation facility in the area and set up a care schedule that was actually sustainable. I helped my mom restructure their finances to account for the extended rehabilitation costs. I found her a therapist, a real one, a good one, because she needed support that was beyond what family could provide. I organized the neighbors who wanted to help into something actually useful, meal drops on specific days, a shared calendar, a point person for coordination, so my mom wasn't fielding 47 well-meaning phone calls. I handled it all, working remotely in the evenings after family logistics were done, sleeping 5 hours a night, running on caffeine, and the particular adrenaline of knowing you are the person standing between your family and chaos. On my last night before flying back to Chicago, my mom and I sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone home. It was late. The house was quiet. She looked exhausted and smaller than I remembered, and for a moment she was not my complicated mother. She was just a tired woman who was scared and grateful, and not quite sure how to say any of that. She looked at me across the table and said, I don't know what we would have done without you this week. I nodded, and then she said, quietly looking down at her hands, I know we haven't always been fair. With you and Brianna, I know things haven't always been balanced. I know that. And I went very still, because my mother had never said anything like that to me. Not once. Not in all the years I had been waiting for it, without admitting I was waiting. She said, I'm sorry, Harper, for graduation, for all the times I should have seen you more clearly, and I didn't. I'm sorry. Her voice broke on the last word. She didn't look up. I didn't say it was okay. I had made a promise to myself a long time ago that I would stop saying things were okay when they weren't. Instead, I reached across the table and took her hand, and I said, I hear you, Mom. And she cried, and I sat with her while she cried. And it wasn't a complete repair. Repair never happens in one night at one kitchen table in the wake of something that accumulated over years. But it was the beginning of something real. The first honest thing between us in a very long time, and I held on to it. My dad's recovery was long and hard, and ultimately, far better than the initial prognosis suggested. He worked in rehabilitation with a commitment that honestly impressed me. The same methodical stubbornness that had always defined him now pointed at getting his body and his speech back. By the following spring, he was walking without assistance. By summer, his speech had returned to something close to normal, slower, more deliberate, but clear. He retired from his corporate job and found, to his own apparent surprise, that he didn't miss it. He started spending his mornings in the garden, which was something he had never done before, and there was something in that quiet domesticity that seemed to settle him, to humanize him, a little in ways that made him easier to know. About 8 months after the stroke, he asked me to sit with him on the back porch during one of my visits. He was in his regular chair, looking out at the garden he had planted, and he took a moment, the way he did now, gathering himself. And then he looked at me directly and said, "I owe you some apologies. Real ones. Not the kind your mother and I have been giving you, which weren't really apologies at all." He paused. "Your graduation. We should have been there. I should have been there. There is no explanation that justifies that. I was wrong, and I have thought about it more times than you probably realize. I want you to know that. And I want you to know that you have never been anything except exceptional, and we did not always treat you like it. That's not on you. That has never been on you. That was entirely on us." I sat on that porch for a long time after he finished. I thought about the 22-year-old on the floor of her apartment. I thought about Aunt Patricia in her purple dress. I thought about 7 years of building a career, building friendships, building a self that was solid enough to withstand the absence of external validation. And I thought about what it meant to hear this now. Not too late, because honesty is never too late, but long. A long time coming. I told my dad I heard him. I told him I appreciated it. I told him I forgave him, not because everything was fine and none of it had mattered, but because I had been carrying the weight of it for 7 years, and I was ready to put it down. Forgiveness, I had learned, is not for the person being forgiven. It is for the person doing the forgiving. It is permission to stop carrying something heavy. I gave myself that permission on that porch, and I meant it. Things with Brianna shifted gradually, the way the most durable shifts do. Not one conversation, but many small ones over the course of a year or more. She and Derek were trying to start a family and finding it harder than they'd expected, and that experience, the particular humility of wanting something and not being able to control whether you get it, seemed to open something in her. She became a little quieter, a little less performative, a little more willing to reach for actual connection instead of surface charm. She called more. She asked about my life with something that felt like genuine curiosity rather than conversational habit. Once, in the middle of an ordinary phone call, she said without preamble, "I know I wasn't always good to you when we were growing up. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. I'm sorry." And I said, "Yeah, you weren't, but we're both different people now." And she said, "I really am trying to be." And I believed her. Not completely, not without some remaining caution. But I believed her enough to keep showing up. And sometimes enough is the right amount. The year that followed my dad's stroke was, in a strange and unexpected way, one of the most meaningful years of my adult life. Not because of anything professional or romantic, but because of what happened to my family when performance was no longer an option. My dad, stripped of the corporate armor he had worn for 30 years, slowed by the stroke, became someone I could actually talk to. He had time that he had never allowed himself before. He had a garden he was tending. He had mornings with no agenda. And in that space, he became, gradually, a person I could recognize rather than a role I observed from across the room. We talked about his own father, a man who had been withholding and exacting in ways that mapped precisely onto things I had experienced from him. We talked about regret, real regret, the kind that does not explain itself away. Those conversations cost us both something real. They were also the most valuable exchanges of my entire life with him. My mom became more herself too, or perhaps a version of herself that had been waiting under the surface for a very long time. She went to therapy every week and took it seriously in a way that surprised me and moved me. She began telling me things she had kept private for years. She told me she had known, for a long time, that things had not been balanced between me and Brianna, that she had seen it and had not known how to address it and had chosen the easier path of smoothing it over. She said those words, "I chose the easier path," and the directness of them, the complete absence of excuse-making, landed somewhere deep in me. It did not undo the years. Nothing undoes the years, but it acknowledged them. And acknowledgement, real acknowledgement, is its own kind of healing. I have learned to receive it as such. I'm 29 years old. I'm sitting in my apartment in Lincoln Park, the apartment with the high ceilings and the clawfoot tub and the kitchen window that looks onto the tree-lined street. The apartment that is completely and totally mine. I got promoted to director last year. I run a team of 9 people who are sharp and motivated, and who I am genuinely proud of. I travel for work sometimes, and I love it, and I resent it in roughly equal measure, which I think means the balance is about right. I'm not in a relationship right now, and I am more genuinely okay with that than I have been with almost anything in my life. I know who I am. I know what I'm made of. I know that my value has never been and will never be determined by who shows up for me or who doesn't. I know that because I spent 7 years proving it quietly in the daily work of building a life that is actually mine. My parents and I talk every week now. Real conversations, not the 12-minute performances we use to give each other. My dad asks about my work and actually wants to know the answer. My mom tells me things, real things, the underneath things, the fears and regrets and wishes she kept private for so long because showing vulnerability was something she had never been taught was safe. We are not the family we were when I was 22. We have been broken open and reassembled into something more honest, something more real. It is not perfect. Nothing true is perfect, but it is genuine, and that is so much better than the alternative. That is worth every hard thing it took to get here. There is one more thing I want to say before I finish, because I think it is the most important part, and I do not want to leave it out. I want to talk about what it means to hold 2 things at the same time. To love people who have hurt you, to forgive without pretending the hurt was not real, to show up for a family that did not always show up for you, and to do it not out of obligation, not out of hope that they will finally see you clearly, but out of a choice about who you want to be regardless of what anyone else is doing. I showed up for my family when my dad had his stroke, because that is who I chose to be, not because they had earned it, not because the graduation had been made right, not because everything was resolved. I showed up because I had decided, somewhere in those 7 years of building and healing and becoming, that I was not going to let their failures determine my character, that I was going to be the person who shows up, not for them, for me, because being the person who shows up when it matters, even when it is hard, even when the history is complicated, that is a version of myself I am proud of. And nobody's absence, nobody's failure, nobody's choices can take that from me. If I could go back and talk to the 22-year-old Harper standing in her apartment with the phone in her hand and the floor tilting under her feet, I would say this: what they did was wrong. Full stop. No qualification, no softening, no, but family is complicated. Choosing your other daughter's birthday party over your firstborn child's college graduation is wrong, and you are allowed to know that completely and feel every bit of the hurt that comes with it. You don't have to minimize it. You don't have to understand it. You are allowed to be devastated and angry and sad. And you are also allowed, when you are ready on your own timeline, not a moment before anyone else decides you should be, to put it down, to decide that this is a chapter and not the whole story, to take the pen back. Because here is what I know at 29 that I could not have known at 22. The people who underestimate you, who overlook you, who choose the path of least resistance when you needed them to choose you, those people do not get to write your story. They get a chapter, sometimes a painful one. But the pen is yours. It has always been yours. And you can write something extraordinary with it if you decide to. I decided to. 7 years ago, sitting on the floor of an apartment in Chapel Hill, I decided. And then I got up. And then I built it. Every single piece of it. By hand, in the quiet, when nobody was watching. That is mine. Nobody can take that from me. Nobody. My name is Harper Grace Johnson. And that is exactly who I am.